My maternal grandfather, John Augustine, or Gus, Barry, was the third generation of a line of blacksmiths whose workshop was situated in the main street of Yass. He was part of a large extended family that include many in Yass itself, as well as uncles, aunts and cousins in the surrounding country areas, especially around Binalong, northwest of Yass. Gus's grandfather, James Barry, had been the first blacksmith in Yass. James was the son of Irishman Thomas Barry, a blacksmith in the small village of Ballycarl, north of Cashel in Tipperary County, Ireland. Thomas Barry and his wife Margaret had 3 sons, Lawrence, James and Jeremiah, known as Darby, as well as a daughter, Mary. In 1832, all 3 sons were transported as convicts to Australia for the one shared crime of manslaughter. The 3 Barry brothers were each sentenced to 7 years transportation to New South Wales. The relative lightness of these sentences suggests that the man's death, of which they were accused, was an accident, perhaps the result of a drunken brawl in the local tavern. This event would lead to the growth of a large Barry family clan around Yass and its local countryside. The stories of these Barry family members are typical of many of the people living in the Greater Yass area during the pioneering days of the 19th century. All 3 Barry brothers were transported on the Eliza, arriving in Sydney after a 6-month voyage in September 1832. A small glimpse into life on this ship is provided by a reference to James Barry found in the ship's surgeon notes, where it is recorded that James suffered from heart and bowel problems. These were treated with an emetic called ipecac, a syrup causing vomiting and diarrhoea. It was particularly useful for suspected poisoning, raising some questions as to what was actually happening on this voyage. Upon arrival in Sydney, the brothers were assigned to work in different parts of New South Wales, though they all eventually moved to the Yass area, where their sister and brother-in-law, Mary Treacy, would later join them. Yass was a relatively new town in the 1830s, about 80 kilometres west of Goulburn and surrounded by good pastoral land. The greatest ambition of aspiring Irishmen was to own their own land. In Ireland, the land had generally been controlled by the Anglo-Irish Protestant ascendancy, and few Catholics could own their own land. The new lands of New South Wales provided opportunities for ownership that Irish Catholic families had never had before back in their homeland. Of the 3 Barry brothers, the eldest one, Lawrence, seems to have been the most ambitious, almost immediately acquiring land at Binalong, northwest of Yass. More conservatively, his brother James followed the occupation of his father by becoming the blacksmith in the main street of Yass. Younger brother Jeremiah, known as Darby, tried farming and then later ran a pub for a while in Binalong. This venture was not a success, and he returned to farming. The Barry's brother-in-law, Mary's husband, Mary Treacy, became the blacksmith in Binalong, as well as spending some time in Goulburn jail. We now look at each of their families in more detail. Before making his home in Yass, my great-great-grandfather James was assigned to work on the Dobroyd estate, about 8 kilometres west of Sydney. He was then in his mid-20s and is described as being 5 foot 11 inches tall, of ruddy complexion, having grey eyes, as well as a broken left forearm from a previous accident. He could read but not write. The Dobroyd estate to which James had been assigned covered most of the present suburb of Haberfield in Sydney and was owned by the daughter and son-in-law of Simeon Lord, the wealthy ex-convict merchant. Working on this estate, James met another convict, 18-year-old Sarah English, who had been sentenced to transportation for stealing some caps and pillowcases in a brothel. She had been transported to Sydney in 1831, the convict records describing her as being 5 foot 2 inches tall, ruddy and freckled, with brown hair and blue eyes. Because they were both convicts, James and Sarah had to seek permission from the governor before they could marry. When this was granted, they married in St Mary's Catholic Church, the church that later burned down and was replaced by St Mary's Cathedral. Some years later, they moved to Yass, where Sarah bore 13 children over a 21-year span, 8 boys and 5 girls, one being born every year or two. James set up a blacksmith workshop on the corner of Yass's main street, Comer Street and Rossi Street, where it was to remain till the Depression of the early 1930s, as his son and grandson continued with the business. Today it is a tyre centre. There are very few references to James in the local media, but there is one in 1859 when he was 48, noting that he had been contracted to supply the ironwork for the renovation of the bridge over the Yass River. As a blacksmith, he would have done a range of jobs that involved working with iron. A couple of his sons lived more varied lives. Michael, the second youngest, a champion wrestler in his younger days, owned the Barrys livery and coach stables on the east corner of Rossi Street, opposite his father's blacksmith shop. Michael was later the contractor for taking passengers and the mail from Yass Township to the train at Yass Junction, 4 kilometres away. The youngest Barry's son, Patrick, was a billiard marker who lived in Yass till his late 90s. The occupation of billiard marker was a rather shady one. Essentially, it involved keeping scores for players, allocating tables, cues and chalk, as well as coaching learners and collecting fees for the use of tables. However, it also involved supervising betting on matches and other activities whose legality was dubious. Spending one's days around billiard tables would not have been an occupation highly regarded by members of the more respectable community of Yass. James himself died in 1873, aged 62, of inflammation of the lungs due to the dust surrounding the blacksmith shop. This left my great-grandfather Jack, then aged 30, to take over the blacksmith shop, his younger brothers being in their very early 20s or teenage years. James's wife Sarah died 3 years later, aged about 65, also from inflammation of the lungs. Like her husband, her lifespan was shortened by living so close to the blacksmith shop. In what would have been extremely difficult living conditions, Sarah had raised a family of 8 sons and 5 daughters, almost all of whom lived to have long adult lives. The lives of James Barry's brothers and sister, and of their children, are mentioned more frequently in the local newspapers. It appears that life in the country was more varied and newsworthy than life in a country town. When Lawrence arrived in Sydney with his brothers, the convict records state that he was 5'7" tall, with fair hair, grey eyes and ruddy complexion. By occupation, he was a farmer, and he could read and write. For the first 7 years, he was assigned to work for Judge John Stephen, who was a well-known colonial legal identity owning the Clareville Estate, a 250-acre property in Belfield on the north side of Punchbowl Road in Sydney. After Lawrence received his certificate of freedom, and now aged 31, he moved to the Yass area, where he married 16-year-old Mary Russell, the daughter of an Irish convict from Limerick. Mary Russell's father had belonged to the White Boys, a secret Irish organisation which took vigilante action to support poor, dispossessed farmers in Ireland. Mary and her mother followed her father as free settlers to New South Wales, Mary being 6 when she arrived in Sydney. At the time of her marriage to Lawrence, she was pregnant and had a daughter later in the same year. Lawrence Barry and Mary went on to have 11 more children, one of whom died in infancy. They moved to the newly settled area of Binalong, about 37 kilometres northwest of Yass. At this time, the Binalong area was just beyond the limits of location proclaimed by Governor Darling in 1829. This meant that technically it was illegal for settlers to receive grants or to lease land beyond these limits, which corresponded to a line just west of Yass. However, it was impossible for the government to enforce this ruling, and local farmers regularly drove livestock beyond these limits to take advantage of the better grazing lands there. The most influential pastoralist in this area, and a neighbour of Lawrence Barry, was Ned Ryan, known as the Patriarch of the Lachlan. During the 1830s and 40s, Ryan acquired extensive holdings of land in the Gaylong, Harden and Burrawa areas northwest of Binalong. A native of Tipperary, Ned Ryan had been one of a party of rebels who attempted to burn down a British arms barracks in Ireland. He was sentenced to 14 years transportation and arrived in Sydney with 12 of the other Tipperary rebels in 1816, 15 years before the Barry brothers arrived. Ryan was originally assigned to James Meehan, and later to Meehan's son Thomas, on whose behalf he drove livestock beyond the limits of location as early as 1826. By 1830, when Ryan received his freedom, he had already established himself as a pastoralist in the Gaylong area. In 1841, the Commissioner of Crown Lands reported that Ryan's property at Gaylong held 77 people, many of whom would have been convict shepherds, as well as 980 cattle, 60 horses and 5,000 sheep. Over the next couple of decades, Ryan continued to expand his holdings till he died in 1871, a man well respected in the local area and visited by civil and church dignitaries. Although Ned Ryan does not appear to have made any systematic attempt to draw Catholics from Tipperary and its nearby counties to the Yass area, Irish ex-convicts were understandably drawn to the area of Yass, Binalong, Harden and Burrawa, such that it was referred to as a slice of Tipperary. In the 1841 census, 47% of the Lachlan squatting district was Catholic, generally of Irish origin, and in later decades this proportion increased. In the 1861 census, Binalong was 75% Catholic, Burrawa was 51% Catholic, and nearby Jugeong was 72% Catholic. In quoting these figures, it is not meant to suggest that this Irish community was particularly religious or observant. In fact, in the earlier part of the 19th century, visits to the area by clergy were rare events. Rather, it meant that the Irish were reproducing a society similar to the one that they had left behind in Ireland, a society where the practice of Catholicism had only become legal as recently as 1829. In Ireland, the practice of Catholicism was the Irish people's most potent and symbolic way of distinguishing their identity from and their opposition to their English rulers. In New South Wales, Irish ex-convicts were looked down upon by the English free settlers class, and Catholicism was the glue that held the Irish community together. During the 1840s, when the small town of Binalong was being set up, Lawrence was one of the main contributors to the building of the original Catholic Church in Binalong. He had gone from being a convict to a respectable citizen of the growing Binalong area, and from being a mere farm labourer to being a successful squatter. Over the 3 decades from 1838 to 1869, Lawrence's wife Mary bore 12 children, 5 boys and 7 girls. As a mother of such a large family, Mary experienced many challenges. A mother at 16, she bore 6 children over the next 9 years. Her 4th child, Margaret, born when Mary was 23, died before her 1st birthday. Almost immediately, Mary had another daughter, whom she also called Margaret. The following year, Mary had a son, and then no more children for another 8 years. In 1850, Lawrence, who was now 43, with a 28-year-old wife and 5 children to look after, was able to find a housemaid to help his wife. In that year, a ship brought out 194 girls from the workhouses of Ireland to Sydney. The girls walked to Goulburn and then on to Yass, where most were hired as domestic servants, the remainder continuing on to Gundagai. One of these girls, Catherine Russell, was hired by Lawrence to assist his wife Mary in running the household. Like many of these girls, Catherine went on to marry a local Irishman. Records of this time focus almost entirely on the activities of men, but stories such as these give some sense of the difficulties women endured. Unlike their parents, who had travelled across the world to Australia, Most of the adult sons of Lawrence and Mary Barry stayed in the Binalong area and worked on Lawrence's farm or on other local farms. In 1888, by which time Lawrence was 81, there were extensive and damaging bushfires in the Binalong-Gaylong area, and the Bathurst Free Press noted that the properties of Lawrence Barry and of his 67-year-old nephew, Lawrence Treacy, were damaged by these fires. A few years later, Lawrence died on his property at the age of 84. His wife Mary lived on to 1903, aged 81, dying in Young, where two of her daughters then lived. My impression of Lawrence Barry is that he was probably the most successful of the Barry family that had come to New South Wales. Though not reaching the upper levels of local society, he was respected as a middling level farmer and as a significant contributor to the local Catholic community. He must have been a determined man to survive the harsh life of a farmer in this area, and the fact that he was still farming into his late years shows his toughness. From what I can find, most of his children lived stable lives and did not suffer the misfortunes and tragedies of those of Lawrence's younger brother, Darby Barry, and of his sister, Mary Treacy. When Darby, the youngest of the three Barry brothers, arrived in Sydney in 1832, he was described in the convict records as being 19 years old, 5 foot 11 inches tall, with grey eyes, brown hair and a ruddy complexion. He could read and write. He was assigned as a labourer for 7 years to Henry O'Brien of Yass Plains. Henry O'Brien was the largest stockholder in the Yass district and a squatter of considerable influence, being a Justice of the Peace, a magistrate, and later a member of State Parliament for Yass Plains. When Darby Barry gained his Certificate of Freedom in 1839, he was allowed to remain in the Yass area. Perhaps this was the reason his two brothers, his sister and his brother-in-law all decided to settle around Yass. Darby does not seem to have been the successful farmer that his brother Lawrence was, but records of his donations to the local Catholic Church in Binalong suggest that he was a moderately successful farmer in the Binalong area. In 1844, Darby married Honora Hannon, a young Irish immigrant and a former maid from Ballybricken in Limerick, a small village about 60 kilometres west of Darby's original home of Ballycarl. At this time, Darby was 35 and Honora was 21. Together, they had 10 children, 4 sons and 6 daughters. In 1860, when most of these children had been born and the older ones were in their teens, Darby, now 47, was granted a general publican's licence to operate the Shamrock Inn at Binalong, supported financially by his brother Lawrence. While many Australian pubs have been run by Catholic family dynasties, there does not seem to be any history of the Barry family owning pubs, and for whatever reason, Darby's venture failed. By 1865, he was bankrupt. Darby and his family went back to farming in Gaylong, not far from his brother Lawrence's farm. Some of Darby's children had lives of tragedy and grief, while others were involved in petty crimes. Darby's first son, James Barry, was born in 1843, the year before Darby and Honora were married. As a 17-year-old, James married a 31-year-old widow, Mary Ryan, whose husband Thomas had died 2 years previously, leaving her with a baby and 3 other children under 6. With children these young, Mary would have needed a lot of support as well as a man to provide for her family. James himself had 5 more children with Mary, one who died in infancy. And James died relatively young at the age of 32, and his poor wife was left to bring up the remaining 8 children. Such stories illustrate how difficult life was for many women at this time. Darby's second son, Thomas, married when he was only 19, and he spent his life in and out of jail as a horse thief. His first offence was in 1882, when at the age of 37 he was required to serve 3 months hard labour at Yass Jail for stealing a horse. 2 years later, Thomas was arrested for the same crime, this time serving 3 years at Berrima Jail. The jail entrance books record that he was a labourer who had a broken nose, a scar over his left eye, and that he had had no education. He does not appear to have offended again, and Yass Courier records him as dying at Binalong in July 1905, aged 60. Darby's youngest son, Jeremiah Jr., died after being thrown from a sulky while intoxicated. This was such a common way for men to die at this time that it was always emphasised if a person had not been intoxicated if he died this way. I get the impression that Darby's family lived in poorer and more primitive conditions than those of his brother Lawrence, and that there was a degree of criminality in the area. This impression is increased when looking at the lives of Darby's daughters. 2 of Darby's daughters married violent or criminal husbands. One daughter, Margaret, in 1874, married an ex-prisoner, Robert Reedy, just released from Goulburn Jail. In 1872, his jail description recorded that he was a labourer, 5 foot 7 inches, of sallow complexion, and could not read or write. He came from Bango, a tiny rural village about 12 kilometres north of Yass. Robert had previously been sentenced to 15 months in Goulburn Jail for larceny. His wife Margaret was 25 years old when she married him. He was 1 year older, and they went on to have 8 children. Robert was not involved in any further crimes, but in 1914 he murdered his wife and then committed suicide. This tragic event was described by the local newspaper
Shortly before 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, a shocking double tragedy occurred in Mount Street, North Yass, when Robert Reedy, aged 66 years, struck his wife on the back of the head with an axe and cut her throat with a knife. Subsequently, he committed suicide by cutting his throat practically from ear to ear. When discovered by the police, both the man and the woman were dead. Reedy lived in a 4-roomed weatherboard tenement with his wife, his son, and a granddaughter named Mary Reedy, aged 9 years. He was on friendly terms with his wife and the members of the family, but had become peculiar in his manner for some time past. It is thought that he had developed religious mania. He had previously threatened to kill his wife. Reedy was for many years a patient at the Kenmore Asylum at Goulburn.
Margaret's younger sister, Mary Barry, married into a criminal horse-stealing family when she married Lawrence Dunlay. Lawrence's father had been a convict transported from Tipperary for forgery. He moved to Blackney Creek, a very small village out of Gunning. Here he raised a family of 8, at least 3 of whom were horse stealers. By the time he was only 14, Lawrence Dunlay had already been convicted, with his elder brother, of having slaughtered a stolen animal. In the same year, he was charged with armed robbery. He was sent to Darlinghurst Jail, where he was described as being 5 foot 4 inches tall and having no education. 8 years later, he was charged with horse stealing and highway robbery. He was sentenced to 18 months in Goulburn Jail, where he was described as a labourer, 5 foot 9 inches, stout and sallow in appearance. He was arrested again for horse stealing 4 years later, and this time he was sentenced to 5 years in Berrima Jail. When he was released from jail, he married Mary Barry. By now, Mary was 32, a relatively mature age at this time to be married for the first time. Perhaps she had been waiting faithfully for Lawrence while he was in jail. They had 2 children in the first few years, but Lawrence continued to steal horses till they moved out of the area to Orange to avoid further capture and prison sentences. Darby Barry died in Yass on the 13th of July 1891 at the age of 78, just a few months before the death of his brother, Lawrence. Darby's wife, Honora, had died 11 years earlier. Darby does not strike me as being strong or as respectable as his eldest brother, Lawrence. Admittedly, he showed initiative in running a hotel, but this venture failed, perhaps because of his lack of drive. Some of his children drifted towards criminality, but none more so than the family of Darby's younger sister, Mary, who was herself married to a violent husband, Mary Treacy. Mary Barry, the younger sister of Lawrence, James and Darby, was born in 1814. She married Mary Treacy, also a blacksmith at Ballycarl in Tipperary in 1836, 4 years after Mary's 3 older brothers had been transported to New South Wales. By this time, Mary's father, Thomas Barry, was a 46-year-old blacksmith. Did he hire the younger Pierce to work with him after his 3 sons had been transported? And did he perhaps plan to pass on his business to Mary and Pierce in the absence of any other descendants in Ireland? Whatever Thomas's plans might have been, they came to nothing, as 5 years later Mary and Pierce emigrated to New South Wales. Their decision to emigrate was probably prompted by Pierce's run-in with the law in Ireland and his subsequent sentence to 2 months on the treadmill for throwing a stone at the manager of the Thurles Agricultural Bank. Pierce was a big, strong man, about 6 feet tall, and as later events would show, he had a fiery temper. Mary and Pierce arrived in Sydney as free immigrants on the Glens Willy in March 1841, with a 3-year-old son. The arrival records describe Pierce as a blacksmith, whose parents were already dead. His health was very good, but he could neither read nor write. His wife Mary was a farming servant, also of very good health and unable to read or write. Several other Tipperary families arrived on the same boat, and many of them proceeded to the Yass area to join their fellow countrymen there. Mary and Pierce settled in Binalong, where their next child was born the following year, 1842. Pierce became the Binalong blacksmith in Dixon Street, near the centre of town. Over the next 10 years, the couple raised a family of 6, 4 sons and 2 daughters, with an additional daughter, Margaret, who had died in infancy. Pierce was constantly in trouble for his temper and his violence. He was sent to jail on 3 occasions, and life must have been very hard for Mary and her children during these times. In 1855, when he was 44 years old, Pierce was sent to Goulburn Jail for 3 months. In 1857, he was convicted of the more serious crime of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 6 months hard labour in Goulburn Jail. In 1876, when he was 65 years old, Pierce was charged with feloniously wounding a man. He was sentenced to 18 months hard labour in Goulburn Jail. By this time, fortunately, his children had all grown up, and 2 of his sons were running his blacksmith shop in Dickinson Street. Pierce died 3 years later, in 1879, aged 68. His wife Mary died the following year, in 1880, aged 66. Mary's brothers, Lawrence and Darby, both outlived her, dying in 1891. Mary, Pierce and Lawrence were all buried in Gaylong Cemetery. They had created a large Barry and Treacy clan in the Binalong area. Like the Barry families, the Treacys lived varied lives, some being far more successful than their father had been, others experiencing tragedy. Two sons, Edward and Pierce Jr., took over their father's blacksmith business. When Edward finally died in 1908, his death notice revealed a very different character from that of his father.
There passed away on September the 18th an old and very respected resident of Binalong, in the person of Mr. Edward Treacy. Deceased was a native of Binalong and one of a family of 6, 4 of whom are still living, namely Mrs. L. and P. Treacy of Binalong, Mrs. Dempsey, Gundagai, Mrs. Madden, Broken Hill. Another brother, Mr. Jerry Treacy, died some years ago. The late Mr. Edward Treacy never married. He carried on a blacksmith's business in the town until about 3 years ago, when he met with an accident. The immediate cause of death was heart failure.
Edward's younger brother, Pierce Jr., continued with the business for many years, still being described in the electoral rolls of 1932 as a blacksmith, even though he would have been 80 by this time. Another son, Lawrence Treacy, was at one time the licensee of the Golden Fleece Hotel in Binalong, a block away from his brother's blacksmith shop. Lawrence's move into the hotel business is surprising, given his wife Joanna's history with hotels. She was the daughter of 2 free immigrants from Tipperary. Her father had been a carpenter and also a hotel keeper who had been burnt to death in a hotel explosion in 1854 at the relatively young age of 36. Joanna herself died in 1885 at the age of 35, leaving a very young family for Lawrence to look after, 5 of their children being under 10. Lawrence Treacy was also the pound keeper for Binalong. This position included impounding lost or strayed livestock and advertising them for sale if not claimed. Lawrence lived on till 1921, when he died in Yass, aged 71. His obituary outlined a life of achievements.
Mr. Lawrence Treacy of Binalong died at the Yass Hospital at the age of 81 on Thursday. He was admitted to the hospital suffering from a severe cold, but death was due to senile decay. In the early 70s, he was appointed pound keeper at Binalong and held the position for 50 years. Prior to this, he was an auctioneer in Yass, in which town he was born in 1840.
Unlike most women who left very few records, 2 of the Treacy daughters, Anastasia and Mary, both left records of very different kinds of lives, one successful, the other tragic. Anastasia lived a reasonably prosperous life. In Binalong in 1868, she married Arthur Dempsey, who was descended from convicts on both sides of his family tree, including 2 who had been on the First Fleet, Anthony Rope and Elizabeth Pulley. Arthur himself, however, had moved up into the financially successful classes. Beginning as a butcher in Binalong, where he met Anastasia, Arthur moved on to manage a number of hotels over the coming years. After living for 10 years in Binalong, where they had 4 children, Anastasia and Arthur moved to Cootamundra, 70 kilometres west of Binalong, where Arthur built and ran the Terminus Hotel for 8 years. During this time, they had 6 further children, but these were years of great sadness for Anastasia. In their first year there, her eldest 10-year-old daughter, Sophia, died as a result of overbalancing into a boiler of scalding water. At the same time, Anastasia had a little boy, James, who died 2 years later of dysentery. A year later, she had another boy, George, who died as a 1-year-old. In later years, 2 more of Anastasia's daughters were to die prematurely. Her third daughter, Winifred, at 15 from consumption, and her last daughter as an infant. In the meantime, Anastasia's husband, Arthur, had quickly established himself as an identity in the local racing scene, being the regular starter of the Cootamundra races, as well as purchasing and training racehorses. He was also a successful jockey, passing his love of horse racing on to his sons, with unfortunate results. His eldest son, also named Arthur, suffered a dislocated shoulder, while his second son, Ollie, broke his leg while riding as a jockey, and later lost his left hand when bitten by a savage stallion. Arthur's youngest son, Sid, must have been a major disappointment to his parents, as he was constantly in trouble with the law from a young age. When aged 12, Sid broke into a butcher's shop, stealing meat and money, for which he was fined. 4 years later, he broke his arm in a fall from a horse on a Sunday night while hell-raising in Gundagai. In 1920, when he was 35, he was arrested for using cyanide on possums for skinning and sale of the skins. In the following year, he was fined for stealing a suit of clothes. In 1926, Sid, now 41, was in court for stealing property from his father. During the court hearing, it was noted that Sid had been convicted 62 times for a range of offences. 2 years later, in 1928, he was sentenced to 6 months hard labour, after which he was a broken man. He worked as a labourer for the rest of his life, staying with his older brother Ollie, neither marrying nor being in any further trouble with the police. During this time, Anastasia and her large family continued to move around the state, her husband managing a number of hotels with varying degrees of success. In 1888, when they had moved to Gundagai, Arthur was briefly bankrupt, but in typical style, 2 years later, he found alluvial gold north of Gundagai to remedy his fortunes. When he died in 1935, the following obituary was published.
The death occurred recently at Gundagai of Mr. Arthur Dempsey, aged 90, at one time licensee of the Terminus Hotel Goulburn. Born in Windsor in 1846, Mr. Dempsey had a wide and varied career as a bushman, businessman and racing identity. He was a past master in the bush, and long treks with big mops of cattle made him one of the most noted men of his day. As a horseman and a judge of horseflesh, he had few equals. Hotel keeping and butchering were his principal business occupations, and he built and conducted for many years the Terminus Hotel at Cootamundra. It's on the record that no tramp or battler ever left his home hungry. He had practical experience on many of the rich alluvial goldfields.
Arthur's wife, Anastasia, had already died 13 years earlier. At the time of her death, she had a broken leg, the result of a traffic accident she had been in while visiting Sydney. Anastasia had lived a successful but demanding life, bearing 11 children, moving around the state many times and running a range of hotels. The Gundagai Times described her as
a woman of robust constitution and charitable disposition. She was for many years in the hotel keeping business with her husband in Gundagai, Cootamundra and other centres.
Anastasia's younger sister Mary had a very different and much more tragic life. Mary began an unmarried relationship with James Madden from Gundagai in the mid-1880s, when she was about 36 years old. Over the next 6 years, Mary had 3 children with James. The first, Ada, was born in Cowra in August 1885. The second child, Edward, 3 years later, again in Cowra, and the third child, Jane, in Parkes in 1891. Sadly, little James died there the following year. Clearly, the family was moving around Western New South Wales during these years, and perhaps James was looking for work. In 1896, the young family was at Peak Hill, 50 kilometres north of Parkes, where James was a miner. In that same year of 1896, James deserted his wife and young family, and Mary, now 49, was left destitute. The consequences for the children, 10-year-old Ada and 7-year-old Edward, were disastrous. An official record of the time states that the children were without lawful visible means of support and were begging for food from neighbours. Both were taken away to Sydney, where they were placed in institutions. Ada was sent to a reform school, Binalong, in Parramatta, where she stayed for the next 4 years. The entrance books of Binalong state that Ada was found without any lawful visible means of support, that her education was bad, her religion Catholic, and that her parents never married. The reform school at Parramatta served the dual purpose of both reformatory and training school. The girls received minimal education, with the emphasis being on training to be domestic servants. This involved being apprenticed out to households. The industrial school registers state that in Ada's first apprenticeship, she was returned for misconduct, and again in her second apprenticeship, she was returned as unsatisfactory. Ada was finally discharged, aged 15, into the care of her mother back at Peak Hill. Given the dreadful start she had in life, Ada went on to have what would have appeared to be a happy and fulfilling working class life. In 1916, when she was 21, she married an engine driver and lived on at Granville, raising a family of 2 sons and 4 daughters. Ada's brother Edward suffered a different fate. At the age of 7, he was sent to a boys' industrial school on the reform ship Sabroan, moored in Sydney Harbour near Cockatoo Island, and housing more than 200 boys at the time. On this school ship, boys received a combination of moral training, nautical and industrial training and instruction, and elementary schooling. In the entrance book, Edward's education was described as bad and that he was unable to write despite having attended Peak Hill School. The entrance book noted that he was illegitimate and wearing dirty clothes, but that he was of good character and his health was good. After a number of years on the Sabroan, the boys were usually apprenticed out to farmers or other employers. What happened to Edward after this is unknown. The 3 brothers, Lawrence, James and Darby Barry, all started at the very bottom of society when they arrived in Sydney as convicts in 1832. Their younger sister Mary and her fiery husband Mary Treacy, arriving as free travellers 9 years later, were not much better off. As soon as they could, they all followed the movement of Irish Catholics to the southwest via Goulburn on what would later become the Hume Highway. Only James Barry chose to live in the country town of Yass, and most of his family lived on there for a couple of generations. The others either lived on the land as farmers or in small country towns such as Binalong. It was believed that the sons and daughters of convicts might resort to crime, but this was not generally the case. Most of the children of Lawrence, James, Darby and Mary lived respectable and industrious lives, though there were some who committed minor crimes or who married such men. The main goal for most of them was to acquire and work on their own land. For most of the women, their lives were dominated by childbearing and raising their large families in primitive conditions. In researching their lives, I am constantly struck by the difficult living conditions they had to endure and by their apparent resilience. They lived lives that were typical of most rural Australians of these times, and they are worthy of admiration.